Hello folks. Well, we're about 2 weeks into our grand journey, the Frontier Americana Tour. It's just the beginning of August now. As we travel, we notice that the grass is getting less green. It's almost yellowish. The trees are no longer these big lush oaks and maples, but they're more suited for this climate. And so, us being very avid independent travelers here on the Coverage Project, we finally arrived in a state which I think most resembles that spirit of adventure and independence and ambition. That's right, we've arrived in our 31st state, Texas. Well, here in the Lone Star State, for the first time, I think it's time to have us schooled on a little bit of how Texas is so important, significant, and what better place to do that than an old historic schoolhouse. So that's right, school is in session for us. Texas, as a state, is a marvel to behold. Altogether, one could consider just the state an entire region of the US. It is the second largest state in the country, only behind Alaska, which means on the mainland, on the lower 48, Texas is the largest. The culture of Texas is something very interesting. It combines elements of the South, elements of the West, but it also has its own individual characteristics. You might have heard, everything's bigger in Texas. From the food, to the clothes, the hats, the boots, to the spirit, the ego of Texas. Think of the Lone Star State, Texas. What comes to mind? You may think of the huge economy that it has today. It wasn't just today, for a long time. Texas has had such a diverse economy, from the cattle ranching to now the oil industry and a lot of startup tech businesses today. You might think of, well, cowboy culture. It was the epicenter of the cattle trade, and then Wild West towns popped out all throughout the state. Would you think of Texas's mighty jumbo cuisine? You know, those big steaks, and of course classic Texas barbecue. Do you think of the heat, the weather, the climate? I mean, right now it's a sweltering 104 degrees, and that's why I'm inside a little bit, just to get away from the sun and the heat. It has been pretty hot. Finally, this is a state that was once its own country for a little less than a decade. In the mid-1800s, remember the Alamo. Texas independence is a big cultural subject in itself, and the Texans here are very proud to tell you, we were once our independent country. They will say that. All right, let's get out of this old rustic schoolhouse. It is interesting though. This is what the old Texas frontier school children had for their education. Just a one-room schoolhouse. Wooden benches for seats. The teacher would have just a mere blackboard, or maybe the kids would write on the walls here. No fancy smart boards as they have, or Chromebooks or laptops. This was it. But this one-room schoolhouse is not the only thing we see. This is one building of a much larger log cabin village that you can find here in our destination today of Fort Worth, Texas. Like so many states here in the American West, Texas was once a barren frontier land, unknown to the European settlers. Originally, Texas was actually a colony, a part of Mexico, part of originally New Spain. Mexico got its independence, but Mexico still had this area. The people of Texas fought for their independence, had their own country, and a little less than a decade later, joined the US. And around the first years of Texas as a state, this is what you might see of a little Texas frontier village. I guess a good question I would have is, what was the main role of a blacksmith in this area as Texas was in its infancy?
Probably city blacksmiths differed a little bit from country blacksmiths. Probably your country smith would have been focusing more on farm implements and keeping the wagons and the plows going in the ground. Whereas your city blacksmith would probably concentrate on more like your construction, your hammers and chisels and things like that. And around here they had several blacksmith shops. But of course, people needed all kinds of things. I mean, if you're traveling, you're going to need a way to stop and cook at night. Even if you're in your house, you got your hearth, then one of the things people used a lot of was called a spider leg trivet. This could be set right over hot coals. And you could either set a pot right on there, or you could put a slab of meat on there, slowly roast it. Extra long knives and forks made so you don't burn yourself. You can sit there and carve that meat up.
Wonderful. Yeah, like an old rustic Texas barbecue.
Yeah, absolutely. What the air does is it passes over, it speeds up the burn, increases the intensity. By increasing the intensity or the speed of the burn, you're getting a hotter temperature. Right here is 2,500 degrees. I'm going to lay it across the horn of the anvil. Just start that shaping process. See, so this would be considered one side of the S hook. So that locks all those molecules tightly back up again.
Dip. Wait for it to stop dripping. And up. And drip.
Look at that.
Not hard at all.
Well, it's one thing to imagine, to envision what the past here in Fort Worth is like. But it's another thing to actually go to the downtown of Fort Worth and see what it's like as of today. So yeah, now that we're in Texas, I guess I could say let's skedaddle, let's giddy up to Fort Worth. So as you can see behind us, Fort Worth is part of an utterly huge metropolitan area known as the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In Texas, I don't know whether this or the Houston area is larger, but one thing's for sure, this didn't come overnight. Everything, like Fort Worth, started with humble beginnings. The river next to us is the Trinity River. It's along these rivers that settlers, pioneers, and most notably, people in the military decided we should settle here. Let's create an army outpost to protect ourselves from various Native American tribes which were hostile towards the approaching European settlers. It was named Fort Worth, and that's where you get the fort part of it from, Fort Worth. But the military were not the only people who sought a lot of promise in this area. Settlers came here in droves, and what started here was a cattle trade. Ever heard of the Chisholm Trail? Well, here in the Great Plains, the edges of the Wild West, a massive cattle trade happened. Now it still exists to a certain extent today, but back in the mid to late 1800s, that sounded awful, like a car screeching, but anyway, mid to late 1800s, back in the time of the frontier Wild West era, the cattle trade was a predominant source of income. That was Texas's main economy. And so people from all over Texas took part. And that's what started the cowboy culture here. But here in the north central plains of Texas, where it's great for grazing, Fort Worth was a major stop along this Chisholm Trail. Eventually these cattle were going to be herded up to Kansas, Kansas City, that area, ultimately to be slaughtered or used in other purposes. This was the perfect grazing ground for these cattle. So en masse, these cattle were driven up north, and this was a major stop. All in all, whether it was driving the cattle north up the Chisholm Trail, or just an industry booming of cattle ranching, Fort Worth and its surrounding area was known as the place where cows flocked, an abundance of cattle. It became a cow town. And for the next 150 years up until today, the Fort Worth, or Dallas-Fort Worth area, is one of the fastest growing regions in the nation. Fort Worth alone, excluding the outside areas, excluding Dallas, has a population of over 900,000 people. That's insane. Not many cities can boast that their population is almost 1 million. So good job, Fort Worth. You've amassed a sense of attraction in the people and the population growth where you're seen as a major player in the United States. Being the largest state and area on the American mainland, Texas, it's gonna have so many regions with stark differences in geography. Where we are here, this is known as the North Central Plains, or some people might call it the Prairies and Lakes region. And this is where you'll find the typical gentle hills. They aren't really green, they're not truly a desert yet, but it's almost like little prairie area. And sure, there's man-made bridges and skyscrapers all around us, but this is sort of the typical nature you might find. Oh, there we go. We cannot talk about the Lone Star State without talking about the Lone Star flag. This is Texas's state flag. It's pretty iconic within America. People of Texas, they love their state flag. We're now in the heart of Fort Worth's downtown. There's two major districts here in the big city. There's Sundance Square around the downtown business commercial sector of it. The centerpiece of that Sundance Square district we're in was the county courthouse. It's a historic building, but you're not gonna find many historic buildings in this square. What you're actually gonna find are these modern glassy skyscrapers. Now you might find some classy upscale restaurants here, but you know that's not our thing. Now that I think about it, the restaurants, they might not be much, but the buildings themselves, these look pretty historic. I wonder how old they are. It's a very interesting mix. Oh, look at that. Fort Worth clock. I will admit, Sundance Square holds a lot to offer if you like photography. Look at these shots of the cityscape. So we're at this square, but you can see the whole line of high-rise buildings going this way and then that way. You can see the courthouse and all the historic buildings as well. The symbol of Fort Worth is the Texas Longhorn. The Texas Longhorn is a breed, if you can call it a breed, of cattle that were driven across through Texas history. You can see it on the signs. I mean, I think the flag of Fort Worth is the Texas Longhorn. It's on these little facades of buildings, statues, everywhere. Fort Worth is not Fort Worth without the Texas Longhorn. Fort Worth Water Gardens, best place in Fort Worth for a relaxing time. Especially when it gets real hot, like the months of July, August. But alright, I hope you all enjoyed our visit to Fort Worth today here on the Coverage Project. Oh, I'm only kidding. I'm very kidding. There is one part of Fort Worth we need to see, and it's the other little district of the Fort Worth area that is worth the visit for sure. Welcome to the Stockyards. Oh, if this area could speak, it would say yeehaw. all day, every single day. I mean, isn't this the Yeehaw State itself? I just have such a fondness for this area because this is where those original cattle drives took place and continue to take place. Albeit it's a little more touristy these days, but this is where the live Texas history happened. This place is all things Texas. There's the rodeo behind me, steakhouses, and Texan restaurants all across these streets. Of course, plenty of joints to buy Western wear, cowboy boots, cowboy hats, the whole shebang. Come to think of it, I think it's time we blend in now that we are supposedly where the West begins. Well, howdy y'all. I am ready for what's gonna happen in just a minute.
Coming out, wasn't that pretty? Awesome horse, half the cattle drive, they'll be in the pen by...
Oh yeah, was that neat or what? Twice a day here at the Fort Worth Stockyards, those Texas Longhorn cattle are driven through the streets for anyone to see. 11:30 and 4. Just remember those dates because those happen every day, twice a day. A real Wild West Texan experience, seeing those cattle walk by. Quite an experience we've had today in Fort Worth. In such a rapidly modernizing nation, it is nice to see the vestiges of the Old West culture thrive here in Fort Worth. From its very inception, this has been a melting pot of cultures. You know, European settlers, German and Czech immigrants, Mexican vaqueros, African-American cowboys who made up over a quarter of the population here. And it still happens today here in Fort Worth. People all over the world come here to see that Wild West American frontier culture on display here. I chose to make an effort, I don't know if it was an effort, more of a choice, but I chose to go to Fort Worth first because in the Twin Cities of the DFW area, people know Dallas. It's a much more recognizable name. Fort Worth people may have heard of, but it's always in the shadow of Dallas. And so here on the Coverage Project, I wanted to make it clear that Fort Worth is just as much of an important, significant destination. So yeah, was it worth the visit here today? I think so. Fort Worth is something else. Let me tell you, it has been a fun day, and it's only going to continue here in the Lone Star State. We're not just going to blow Texas off. It's such a large state that, of course, we gotta visit a little more locations than usual for a state. So I'm excited. So I'll end off by saying this. Don't mess with Texas. We sure aren't. We are sure giving it the respect it deserves. So sitting here on a nice but very, very hot day here in Fort Worth, Texas, in the Fort Worth Stockyards. More travels to come. I will see you at the next location.